Here in A Time to Build Part 2, I offer 3 books every American should read, especially when they're a little younger. This with a bonus book added at the end as well.
We know more than ever before, but who knew bias was the bane of all you study? We know more than ever before, but who knew bias was the bane of all you study?
The first book is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. I'm going to start off by saying that if you do get a paperback version of Covey's 7 Habits, go ahead and also get some type of audio version as well. This is one of those books you'll want to return to again and again. I've gone through it 3 main times in my life myself, though I reference it constantly. Once as part of a college course, once when it was an assigned task when I was on active duty in the Army, and once when I just revisited the work on my own. The main theme of 7 Habits is building the kind of character that serves a person by cultivating personal, time-honored principles in building a meaningful life. In a lot of ways, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is like a religious text when it comes to how it can be used to garner morals and ethical principles in a willing reader. In fact, I suspect that 7 Habits is inspired by the author's Judeo-Christian faith. I could be wrong. I don't know anything about Dr. Stephen Covey. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. The point is the book is incredibly useful for an individual, and I highly recommend it. The second book is Dave Ramsey's Dumping Debt. Eventually, we had to talk about money. As a matter of fact, we'll have to talk about money a lot during this series. I don't know if there's any cultural invention that has impacted human society more than representative currency. It is so ingrained in our human communities that imagining any version of planet Earth without it is difficult, for better or for worse. For example, take a look at this.
Now, if this reality of inherent and perpetual inflation seems absurd and economically self-defeating, hold that thought, for absurdity is an understatement in regard to how our financial system really operates. For in our financial system, money is debt, and debt is money. Here is a chart of the U.S. money supply from 1950 to 2006. Here is a chart of the U.S. national debt for the same period. How interesting it is that the trends are virtually the same. For the more money there is, the more debt there is. The more debt there is, the more money there is. To put it a different way, every single dollar in your wallet is owed to somebody by somebody. For remember, the only way the money can come into existence is from loans. Therefore, if everyone in the country were able to pay off all debts, including the government, there would not be $1 in circulation.
Now there's more to learn about how our economy actually works along with its impact on our society, and that deserves its own video series. I'm not going to do it. In recommending Dave Ramsey's Dumping Debt, I'm trying to encourage young viewers to rethink how they see their financial lives here in the 21st century. Financial debt, or debt of any kind, prevents the kind of personal freedom that most of us want, or at least say we want. We have largely accepted a version of American culture where we can get what we want now by essentially sacrificing the future. Not that financial institutions let you know that's exactly what we're doing. Most of us will never break out of that consumerism cycle. Indeed, the economy is largely built on those who are unaware of how they're being exploited. But for the few who have the conviction and wherewithal, we can leave the shackles of commercialism behind. As someone who is completely out of debt, I have achieved a peace of mind that people try to replicate while laying on the beach on a summer vacation, but can never truly have that peace of mind because they're worried about how they're going to pay for it all. A little more about that at the end of the video in a bonus video. Next is the most controversial book on the list. I present to you God, A Human History by Reza Aslan. Some of you will hear this recommendation and not continue the series because of your deep, or not so deep, religious convictions, and that's a shame. I think every American should read God, A Human History to have a deeper understanding of the God concept and put that concept of God and organized religion in the proper perspective when it comes to the human story. There's a dual message for both the faithful and the atheist here. To those of you who have a religious faith, I want to boldly proclaim to you that the justice that we seek on this planet will only be put in place when humans do it. There's no one coming to save us. And to the condescending atheist who not so patiently waits for the day when humans grow beyond religion, I'm here to tell you that for evolutionary reasons, you will be waiting just as long as the religious person who's waiting on God to solve our problems. Our best reality, unsurprisingly, is the balance between these things. Aslan's book will help both types of American understand that. It's time to grow up, everybody. As a bonus book, I present the autobiography of Malcolm X. It is an objective truth that Americans have more things in common than they have differences, even though people insist on turning the minority of differences into the hills on which they would die fighting a battle. In the great American melting pot of United States culture, concerning the African American descendants of slaves, which I am, I would be irresponsible not to acknowledge that American citizens don't all have the same starting point when it comes to this time to build. And though I think every American should read it, it is essential that every African American reads the autobiography of Malcolm X. Just like with other books on this list, this book will grant the reader a perspective that they will never be able to unsee. And once that happens, I encourage them to let that inspire their financial and cultural behavior and decision making in a way that reflects positively on themselves as a Black person and then as an American citizen, in that order. For those that might be offended by that sentiment, I would remind you that no matter what, a Black American descendant of slaves has always been seen as Black first, not, unfortunately, as an American citizen first. It is undeniable, and it continues to this day. And any actions that an African American descendant of slaves takes towards building their character and personal wealth, that has to be filtered through this lens until the day we're all seen as American citizens first, and a person of color subsequently after that. Much like what I mentioned a moment ago about waiting for justice to be delivered by a deity as opposed to doing it ourselves, African Americans have been guilty of waiting in vain for hundreds of years for some type of deliverance, for justice. If there was ever a group of Americans that need to accept hard truths and grow up culturally, it's African Americans. No one cares about us more than us, and it's not getting done unless we do it. We either change economically and culturally, or we will be the permanent underclass of the United States for as long as the United States exists. I know it wasn't always, but the choice is now ours. Finishing up, that's my short reading list for a new initiative of building in our culture. You don't know how tempting it was to put at least one science fiction book on this list, because there are so many that are effective allegories for the challenges we face in our human interactions. Down below, why don't you place any books that inspired you to be a more complete person or a better citizen down in the comments. That'll be fun. Stay tuned for the Modern 80s Stinger video at the end of this video. This bonus feature contains more information on money creation in our economic system. I'm Odium. This has been Message in a Bottle, and just remember to stay tuned for the bonus feature that comes after this. But after you watch that, come back for the next reflection.
Yeah, say it all. you know that everybody's still grooving more than what were all of my protests for. I guess the problem was me, yeah.
A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies, saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the Fed. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt, and when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability will become more clear as we further this exercise. So, the exchange has been made and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in Modern Money Mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10% or $1 billion is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in Modern Money Mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, the $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and in turn 90% of the $9 billion or $8.1 billion is now available as newly created money for more loans. And of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion to 6.5 billion to 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that about $90 billion can be created on top of the original $10 billion. In other words, for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air.
Money jitters? Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
So, now that we understand how money is created by this fractional reserve banking system, a logical yet elusive question might come to mind. What is actually giving this newly created money value? The answer? The money that already exists. The new money essentially steals value from the existing money supply. For the total pool of money is being increased irrespective to demand for goods and services. And as supply and demand finds equilibrium, prices rise, diminishing the purchasing power of each individual dollar. This is generally referred to as inflation, and inflation is essentially a hidden tax on the public.
What is the advice that you generally get? And that is inflate the currency. They don't say debase the currency. They don't say devalue the currency. They don't say cheat the people who are saved. They say lower the interest rates. The real deception is when we distort the value of money. When we create money out of thin air, we have no savings, yet there's so-called capital. So my question boils down to this: how in the world can we expect to solve the problems of inflation, that is, the increase in the supply of money, with more inflation?
Of course, it can't. The fractional reserve system of monetary expansion is inherently inflationary. For the act of expanding the money supply without there being a proportional expansion of goods and services in the economy will always debase a currency. In fact, a quick glance at the historical values of the US dollar versus the money supply reflects this point definitively, for the inverse relationship is obvious. $1 in 1913 required $21.60 in 2007 to match value. That is a 96% devaluation since the Federal Reserve came into existence.